So we met at the Sapien Center,
Yeah, I remember.
the that event. I was like right next to you. I had no idea who you were. We were next to the Regenaissance booth, and I'm trying to remember our conversation. I think I just brought up um, how I kind of got into Bitcoin. Um, but yeah, once I think 30 or 45 minutes went by, I realized you were the author of Fiat Food. I was like, oh shit, okay, cool.
Thanks.
Um, so yeah, so in 2020, I had to make some pretty big shifts in my life. I was working in hospitality for 4 years as a restaurant operations manager. I was in food, um, and then COVID hit, and I had to. Well, one, I was unemployed for about 3 to 4 months, and I was reflecting on what I wanted to pivot to. My parents, my family has, their own business within finance, traditional finance, and I began to study for my licenses. So I started working for Charles Schwab for a little bit. And as soon as it's interesting, I was interviewing with someone, with the branch manager of Charles Schwab. And I actually was in the midst of reading the Bitcoin Standard. And in the interview, I showed him the Bitcoin Standard. I was like, yeah, I'm also like looking into Bitcoin. And he didn't seem like too interested, but I got the job somehow, and didn't deflect him away from the from my interest in Bitcoin. But once I got halfway through the Bitcoin Standard, I mean, even a couple chapters in, I was just kind of mind blown, and I think it was due to the environment that we were in the present day. So COVID kind of really just pronouncing societal restrictions, and just felt a little worrisome where things were going, what direction society was going, and how the government was reacting to certain things. And when COVID and the George Floyd riots happened, I like reached out to I just kind of posted something on social media, and I was like, I don't know what we need to do here to kind of collectively figure out a resolution of peace and like try to move forward. And a friend reached out and gave me the Bitcoin Standard, and I that's when my mind was blown. And so I put my beliefs, into action, and actually invested into Bitcoin, and realized I had to hold my own keys, and found Unchained and Unchained Capital. It was previously Unchained Capital. It's now Unchained. Um, and I actually work with them as a 9 to 5, and I've been working with them for almost 3 years. So I've been pretty heads down with learning about Bitcoin just for my own personal selfish reasons, and then also for helping clients and businesses to understand how to hold their own keys, and how to understand how Bitcoin is like the best savings technology we've ever seen when it comes to saving your money and your energy and your time. Um, and then through that, I also was on Twitter pretty heavily, and Twitter was a great way to solidify the ecosystem of this demographic of Bitcoiners, and seeing how people were holding their own keys, what tools they were using. And then that shifted to our food. I started to follow the Meat Mafia guys. I actually I've recorded a podcast with both of them separately. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. I think they were at the Sapien Center having
Yeah, I
events.
did their podcasts too.
Oh,
I
cool.
find them
Nice.
absolutely delightful.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're both amazing gentlemen. And so, yeah, I actually just I'm releasing a podcast with Brett on Monday, I believe. Yeah, Monday, and to hear his story about how he had pretty visceral side effects of consuming alcohol and the standard American diet. Me personally, my health wasn't like terrible. Like I didn't have any major symptoms that were apparent, but I could just feel that my health was not optimal. And so yeah, so Twitter, Bitcoin Twitter, back when it was Twitter, not X, had this unique connection between our food system. And so when I joined Unchained, and I moved to Texas from Massachusetts, I really connected. I've been buying a quarter of a cow from a local rancher, and bone broth and local eggs, and local dairy, and I really saw the benefits to my health and how I felt, and I've been doing that for like 2.5 years now, and it's been a radical improvement in my overall health because I used to kind of drink a lot and eat some processed foods, and even if you're eating meat and different vegetables and fruit, there's potentially, like, if it's not organic, it's you know it has pesticides or different chemicals and whatnot. So being you know intentional with the sourcing of how the sourcing of the food that I eat, um, is something that I really, I actually just like an hour ago, I back here in Massachusetts, I bought some local ground beef that's grass finished from a friend from high school that I didn't even realize his family sold all this meat and eggs, and I was pretty pumped because I usually just eat whatever my parents buy, and so I just bought like $200 worth of meat from a local rancher here, and so I've been pretty passionate about our money system, but also even before finding Bitcoin, our food system. I've had some family members that have faced some health consequences I believe, due to our food system, and I think everybody's affected by this, as you make apparent in your book, Fiat Food. Um, and so I'm really excited to just dive into this conversation with you. I bought your book. I ordered it like 2 weeks ago and it got lost in the mail. So I finally reordered it and I got it on Wednesday. So I was only able to get through up to, on the plane here, chapter 9, the agro educational complex. But before we dive into the book, I just want to hear about your background. I know you kind of discussed it at the Sapien Center having event, but I know you've had a passion for journalism at a pretty young age. And if you just want to maybe describe, that process when you were a teenager. I know you moved to like New York City, and would love to hear, where did that passion come from, and also how, like, the beginnings of your journalism journey.
I was thinking about this recently because I was talking to my wife about a moment I had in an airport when I watched Columbine happen on the TV, and how the reaction of those around me was, of course, disgust and horror. And I felt this odd bit of adrenaline. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to be there. I felt the same way during political scandals. So I was wondering, and I had this conversation with her, if that was something that maybe we're born with, or a tendency that I just had in me, but it's driven my life. The idea that I want to be part of very big stories, and especially big corruption, and try to understand why it's happened, get to the motive
Okay.
behind it. So I
Yeah.
think, I guess, so my short answer is, I think it's always been in me. I think I've always been a journalist. I just didn't know it as a kid. I mean, when I was very young, I wanted to be Jim McMahon of the Chicago Bears, the quarterback, and that evolved, fortunately, because that would never have fed my family. But when I turned 17, I started a newspaper in my hometown of Pennsylvania, and I lived in a very small town. My paper was called the Danvillian, named after the town, and I competed with the other local papers, and I was able to expose a bit of corruption. I uh, got my school superintendent. I forced him to resign by exposing an illegal sabbatical scheme. There was a nursing home that was criminally understaffed, and it was resulting in patient neglect. And my work led to some reforms on that end. So before the age of 18, I felt like I had a bit of chops. I dropped out of high school. I have no formal education. I just didn't understand, or I saw everything in the view as a kid of, in terms of journalism and what could advance my career. And the idea of sitting for another senior year of high school, and with people teaching me things I didn't care about, I had no interest in, or did I have interest in, college professors who had never actually worked in journalism but got journalism degrees and now were explaining to me, who had far more experience at my age already than they did in the real world. So I moved to New York
Mhm.
City, and I just remember I ended my paper in Pennsylvania. And I remember sending resumes to all the papers that were like, just let me mop floors. I just want to get into the newsroom. And I had a very fortunate set of circumstances where I got into a paper called the New York Sun. I got a late night editing job. I would come in early and pitch stories. And from there, they wouldn't hire me because I didn't have a degree, which pissed me off
Mm.
because I was doing better stories than a lot of the reporters. Not to be boastful, but it was just true in terms of the importance of the stories and the placement. But I got contacted by the New York Daily News, who just cold reached out to me and saw the work I was doing and asked if they had a small little position in a Brooklyn bureau. And within 6 months, I was on the national desk chasing the biggest stories of the world, in particular in America, mass shootings, whatever was the big story, I would parachute in, and I loved that job. And it was also a credit to New York City at the time. This was the mid 2000s and the late 2010s, mid 2010s, and it was still very much so a meritocracy, where I was competing against all these Columbia J School kids, but I had a chip on my shoulder, and I liked that, and I worked very, very hard. And I did things that other reporters wouldn't do. And I went to places other reporters wouldn't feel comfortable going. I did so with pride. The journalism at the New York Daily News, which when I was there was the fifth biggest paper in the country, it began to shift, and I could see it turning, and I wanted to get out and I wanted to transition. The other thing was I was gone half the year, and I have 4 young daughters. So my wife was just not feeling that. She's like, I know this is your
Mhm.
passion, you love it, but I didn't sign up to be a single mom. I understood that. I transitioned into book writing. My first book was an examination of the shooting at Newtown, Connecticut, Sandy Hook, called Newtown,
Mhm.
published by Simon and Schuster. I did another book with HarperCollins. Scholastic I've published with my daughter. And when you mentioned earlier about COVID and how that transformed a lot of the ways you thought, and I had the same experience. So I was a pretty mainstream journalist. I was skeptical of things. I'd been into proximity of very powerful people in terms of corporate power and government power, and realized the corruption that was almost innate in these positions. But I didn't think these people were evil. I thought they were just pushing for their best interest, which I didn't think was I don't think that is bad. I think the world really works well when everybody's kind of thinking about their own best interests. And in the way I look at things, there's no really conflict between my best interest and your best interest, so long as we're rational. But this wasn't rational. These people weren't rational. They were very short-sighted. And COVID exposed that times 1,000 to me. So when COVID happened, I fell into Safety Moose. Somebody recommended the Bitcoin standard, which I loved. It shifted me a bit, but it was the Fiat standard, his second book, which really made me made me a different person in many ways, because
Yeah.
I'd always assumed that the government had, in a vague sense, the best interest of the public at heart, even if they made a lot of mistakes. But when I got, as proper terminology is, red pilled, correct, or orange pilled by SAFE, I couldn't unsee the corruption. In particular, in a certain chapter, chapter 8, called Fiat Food, where he posited what on the surface just sounds ridiculous: this weird conspiracy between a religious group, corporate influence, and a few power players that got weaponized by the fiat money printer to create a 50-year gaslighting campaign to change our food system. And his chapter was relatively short, but I remember thinking, I love Safe, but this is insane. He's not an investigative reporter. He's not a nutritionist. Like, what is this? This is beneath him. He should stick to economics, because his economic mind is of the best in the world, I would argue. And then I began fact checking this chapter. And to my shock, Safe, if anything, he had understated his case dramatically. So I just did a cold reach out. I'm like, Safe, here's who I am. You didn't do this justice. This needs a whole book just dedicated to this. And I even said you should start your own publishing company. I didn't know that he had already been thinking about starting his own publishing company, because one of the issues I had with this book and the idea of writing it was I understood that although I was a mainstream journalist, although I had published with every major publishing house and done well, no publishing house would have ever published this book, no major one. So my concern was, how do I get publicity? Because you could write the best book in the world, but if nobody knows it's out there, you're writing to yourself. And what's the point of that? Safe had a built-in audience that I wanted to reach. And it was not just Bitcoiners, but critical thinkers. There's a lot of people, I think, who follow Safe who aren't necessarily Bitcoiners, but they're critical thinkers and they appreciate his different way of looking at things. And they might, I mean, I know there's some who are more into gold. I have arguments against gold. I outline them in my book. As you get to the later chapters, you'll see. But I was able to tap into Safe's audience, and the response to Fiat Food has been absolutely overwhelming. It's being published now in 3 different languages. The sales have far exceeded my expectations, and I'm really proud. And it says something kind of about the place we're in right now. I wrote this book expecting it to be niche. I thought there'd be a market, but it'd be small. I was really thinking about my children and my grandchildren who I don't have yet, and trying to write something important generationally that will help this situation. And it turned out to be something so much more, and it's part because of people like you, where with my other books, I'd be on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. It's like, okay, explain mental illness. You have 2.5 minutes. It's like, well, yeah, I don't know. This format is so much better suited to these long form discussions. And that's why I really appreciate you having me on, Shane.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a pleasure to have you on. And yeah, this book, the dedication and the time you've put into using your journalistic skills to really uncover the progression of the degradation of our monetary system and the food system, to put it into a book format is super helpful, because I knew the food industry was pretty messed up just from an intuitive sense back in 2017. I've talked about this with Brad and Harry from the Meat Mafia. I knew subconsciously that I was just interested in the food industry. And I think it was just because of my own health and seeing some other family members. So I bought Fast Food Nation and Food Inc. And those two books really opened my eyes to factory farming. And Fast Food Nation gets into the progression and evolution of McDonald's and different fast food corporations, and how the process of cutting costs led to factory farming and the quality of the food being degraded. And so, yeah, this format, I think it's much better in comparison to a 2 minute clip on Fox News. Um, so, yeah, from a from a perspective of someone that's not into Bitcoin, trying to think how we can start here with. I suppose we could maybe start off um, with our monetary system. So, or maybe we could start with, because I know you in your podcast with Safe. I watched the majority of that back in October. I think it was released, and you stated at the age of 16 you had some health issues, right? You said you,
Yeah, I grew up in the 90s under the dietary food pyramid. So for your younger audience,
yeah.
that was the suggestion that we eat 8 to 11 servings of grains a day and minimize our saturated fat content in meat to the very tiniest bit. So my mom followed the dietary guidelines. I mean, who would lie about dietary guidelines? And I became fat. I became sick. I got cancer at the age of 16, and I was out of commission for about, gosh, I think it was a year and a half. I was essentially bedridden. And I had a lot of time to think about my
What
health.
What kind of
It's called
cancer?
osteogenic sarcoma in my leg. I played a lot of basketball. And I just remember this weird feeling in my leg. So I exercised a lot. I still was fat. I think I remember being in a hospital bed though at one point asking one of my doctors. I had a team of 3 doctors. They were very good people. And I asked, well, what did I do? Like, why did I get this? And they said, well, we don't really know why people get cancer. It could be genetics, it could be a bunch of different things. I intuitively realized I was really fucking doing something wrong with my diet, though. Like, I was eating tons of shit all the time. And I didn't quite make the connection, but I did know that I was drinking a lot of Mountain Dew to keep the seed oils were out of control. And that doesn't even count what the public school is feeding me. It's just shit I'm eating at home. But when I began my journalistic career and I tried to really, I never wanted to be one of those like survivors. Like I didn't want to define myself by my sickness. So I never really
Mhm.
tried to kind of push past it, but it was always in the back of my head, like what, health, why, like this, like, I don't want to get sick again. Right. Like I have all these children, they're counting on me. My wife's counting on me. Um, so it did send me thinking. And when Safe's chapter came out, that again intuitively made sense. It's like it seemed irrational in terms of this conspiracy he was painting, which turned out to be unbelievably true. But just the idea that we've strayed so far from our nature in terms of health, and there's consequences to that. And I faced one of those consequences, and I continue to do as somebody who's in remission for cancer. It's a cloud that hovers over you, and
Mm.
I want I want to live a healthy, full life. And when I began changing my diet, I didn't understand. I tried to eat healthy, but there's so much conflicting confusion, and we can get into why that is intentional. I mean, that's not by accident. They intentionally have confused the dietary system. It's to their benefit. But when I sort of was able to see through that and just tried carnivore, I've tried veganism, I've tried total plant based, I've tried the juicing fat. I went through that. I've always been seeking, but nothing made. Once I tried carnivore diet, I think after about 3.5 weeks, I was like, "Fuck, this is a life hack." Then it really
Mhm.
hit me, like that I was being cheated out of feeling as good as I feel currently for decades. Not because had a lack of willpower, but it was because I listened to the credentialed experts who failed us completely. And that was my sin. It was trusting white coats.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's a sin. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, people are trusting government officials or these institutions and agencies that are putting out information about nutrition science, and you would think that why would anybody want to fabricate or have inaccurate information about our food system? Like, why would that even be a thing? Why would you know? And I also too have believed like maybe it's just the evolution of business and trying to cut costs, and it's not really this malevolent intention. But then you get into the book and you see that they intentionally. I mean, there's a couple points where they completely obfuscated information. So they had the data, and then they omitted it and went with something else. And this kind of gets into. I mean, there's a few. I think multiple things that they lied about. And so to kind of summarize for the listener that might not be into Bitcoin, might not understand the connection between food and money, you know, um, for me personally, I got into Bitcoin because I wanted to have, enough. I wanted to be financially sovereign so that I could pursue a life that I could freely uh, operate. And everybody's chasing or aiming to retire and have free time when they get older. And when you learn about the current monetary system, you understand that you have to invest what you're making in order to outpace inflation. And so um, I think by starting in chapter one is called John Maynard Keynes, and or that's the name of the chapter, and he plays a big role in our current uh, economic policy and understanding how to operate within our monetary system. Um, I was wondering if you could get into that and maybe from the explain it like well, I don't know if you'll be able to explain it like I'm five, but just to kind of go over that that evolution of, I believe it was during World War One when he was like 31 years old during the Austro-Hungarian. Um, so the Archduke, I think it was his last name's Ferdinand, was assassinated, which prompted some threat to a global war, which then caused banks to become on the brink of collapse, and they were seeking people that were within the, I believe it was the British Treasury, were seeking to find some way of stabilizing the currency and um, stabilizing societal chaos because everybody was trying to redeem their banknotes for gold at that time. So I think if you're able to, if you could maybe just describe to the listener what was happening then, um, why people were trying to redeem their banknotes for gold, and like this link between how gold used to be our monetary um, system. If you're able to kind of brush over that and the importance of why gold was incorporated.
So to go back a little bit, between 1815 and 1914, the world was at relative peace. The Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, and 1914 was the beginning of World War One. The world was at an unprecedented state of peace, and it's no coincidence that there was a gold standard in most of the world at that same time to an unprecedented level. And in 1914, with World War One, a precedent had to be broken because between 1815 and 1914, when there was a gold standard, if a government or a dictator wanted to wage war, they had to either use their treasury, the taxes they've acquired and saved, or tax their citizenry to pay for the war, or sell war bonds, which is also getting your citizenry to pay for the war. Essentially, in that period of time, you needed the consent of the public to wage war for any length of time. And as a result, you just didn't get a lot of war because it was cost prohibitive to the leader to wage war. These leaders, they don't want to send their own children to war, and they don't want to spend their own money for war. And when World War One happened, there was something had to give because the British Empire wanted war, but the people did not have any appetite for another European conflict. They were happy in peace. They wanted peace. So when the war started, there was a rush from people redeeming all around the world, especially in Europe, redeeming their notes for gold. Because that's what money used to be. It used to be we would call it a promissory note, and that promise was you could redeem it for a precious metal. And instability always provokes people to want to bring their gold home. So the notes are essentially promises that you have the gold or metal or silver in the bank, and you get to redeem it on demand. They're holding it for you. They make some interest off of it, and they keep it safe for you. Maybe you get a little interest. That was the long-held deal for hundreds of years. But when England confronted this war that they wanted to wage and realized that the people didn't want it, they brought John Maynard Keynes into the room, who gave justification for a scheme, which he would later call a masterly manipulation, to be able to wage an endless war without the consent of the people. And that would be by transitioning from a gold standard to fiat, which means technically by decree. So they were able to, the government, weaponize not just their treasury towards this war, but the entire productive labor through fiat currency of their nation. And even more so than their nation, because at the time, the Bank of England was kind of the world's bank. It was the economic jewel of the world. The term good as gold comes from the Bank of England. So we came up with a scheme to print paper, not have gold backing, and prolong war. And this scheme has been adopted. And I would argue that Nixon did something similar in 1971. He wanted to keep Vietnam going. And like the Bank of England before, we were committing a bit of a fraud. We had issued more paper promissory notes than we had gold in our reserves. So all it would have taken, Shane, is for a few different countries at the same time to come in and try to redeem their promissory notes at the same time to expose America as a complete fraud. So Nixon decoupled on August 15th, 1971 in his primetime speech. But unlike England, when we decoupled in America, we unleashed the most powerful fighting machine in the history of mankind, because since Bretton Woods, which was an agreement in 1944 that basically said that all the world, the major powers of the world, instead of a gold reserve, they're going to have a dollar reserve. And then our dollar will be based on gold. That was the pledge. When we broke the gold, we were able to weaponize not just the entire American public and their productive labor through fiat, but that of the whole world. Which is why it's no coincidence that since 1971, we've been at war every single year, with the exception of, I believe, 5 years, 76, 77, 78, 2000, and I'm missing a year. But we're in perpetual states of war. And we can do this because of fiat. If we didn't have fiat, we would have to persuade the American public to give up their wealth, which instead we're still taking their wealth. We're just doing it without their consent through the inflationary theft of their money.
Yeah, we're also federally, from a federal and state level, we're taxing. We're still taxing citizens. And it varies on a state level, but federally,
It's interesting. You ever ask yourself why we even have taxes? Like what is it? It's sort of theater, because
yeah, it
they can print as much
is.
money as
Yeah,
they want. Like, what is this? I mean, I'm asking honestly. I've asked some economic minds. Nobody could give me an answer. Um, I just don't. It's interesting. Why? What's the need? We're stealing the taxes we pay through the inflationary theft of our productivity, which is what it is. That's what money is. It's fiat money is the theft of our productivity. It's not just of our money. Our money is our time. And like, why? What's the point of the taxation? I think it's part of like kind of a gaslighting campaign.
yeah. I've seen a funny meme on the internet where there's like a side by side comparison of like 1775 American Revolution. Men were standing up for a 2%. I think it was 2%
Yeah,
tax
yeah.
on tea, and then there's the right side of like 30% federal tax, and we're just kind of letting it happen. And I think back then, or at a certain point in human history, taxes were the only way to fund the government's incentives and policies and ways of governing. And now, since Nixon in 1971 decoupled the US dollar from gold, we're still incorporating federal and state tax, while they're also now, with a click of a button, just creating credit. And so, yeah, on top of seeing your paycheck, getting deducted a specific percentage of your paycheck through federal and state tax, you're also, unbeknownst to a lot of people, you're getting taxed. I call it the invisible tax. I've heard the invisible tax, which is inflation, which is when they create. I was actually trying to describe this to the rancher that I was just speaking to this morning. And to make it simple for people, Michael Saylor calls your savings becoming like a melting ice cube. And so if you have $10,000 in the savings account and you're not putting what you're saving into some investment vehicle that a financial advisor would be able to help you with, that $10,000 is staying numerically the same, but everything around you, the cost of goods and services is increasing because when they create credit, when they print money, though the increasing supply of money is then going and circulating within the economy, chasing the same amount of goods and services. And it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think they should be taxing us at all because now more than ever, I mean, I think I saw a statistic in the past 20 years, we've created like 80% of the money supply.
That's right.
Um, and COVID was just I thought it was 20% when COVID happened. They printed like an incredible amount and they provided, some relief for people that were unemployed because everybody had to socially isolate. I mean, me specifically, I'm one of millions of Americans and or even just other citizens of different countries where I lost my job and I actually put the money that I received to debt that I had from loans, which was uh, helpful for me, but for other people, what they received was not um, couldn't sustain the cost of living for their entire family. And so, yeah, I think it doesn't make any sense to continue to tax people while they're printing an incredible amount of money, and there's no vote on when they do it, how much they do it, what they're doing it for. Um, so I mean,
Fees, there's no need for it. There's no need to tax us.
no,
They could just print as much as they want. I think it's just a flex. Like it's to make us feel like we're involved in the system, that we have a say,
yeah,
and we're going to tax the rich. But you'll see that, to your point, if you buried a $10 gold coin back in 1900, you buried it for 5 years, you dug it back up, you could expect that purchasing power to increase. What fiat does is it turns that advice from your grandmother completely upside down. The natural instinct of man is to save for the future. It's how we've evolved. It's tied into our lineage. Fiat reverses that, where if you actually
mhm.
save your fiat dollars, as we've seen over the past 100 years, where the current fiat dollar has lost 99% of its value over the past 65 years. That's intense. That's unbelievable. And the idea that you own the dollar in your wallet, it's a slogan. It's nonsense. You don't, because there's an unelected person who can make as much of that same dollar as they want. And the fact that they've psyoped us into using this as our trade, our currency of trade, it's criminal.
Yeah, and even going back before Nixon with FDR filing for the executive order six, I think it was 6102, essentially making every American forced to um, give up their gold to the American government. Um, so not even giving them the freedom to hold gold. Yeah, it's just like it's pretty incredible, and I think a lot. It blew my mind when I saw a lot of Americans, a lot of people don't understand what's happening and what's happening to their savings. And so one thing that I thought was pretty incredible also was how I'm not mixing it up with Keys or Keynes, or is it John Maynard
These
Keynes or
two
Keynes?
vile humans in history have the similar name, ironically. It's John Maynard Keynes and then Ansel Keys.
Yeah. So Keynes, I at first thought that he genuinely believed this would help the economy, but then he quotes Lenin. Um,
Yeah, right. It's kind of hard to have goodwill for the guy quoting Lenin. Little red flag,
yeah,
the guy who admires Lenin. It's a bit much.
yeah, and there's one part of his quote which says Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. And there's a longer quote that you put in the book, and it just shows that he was very much aware that by debasing the currency, you could manipulate and control a society. And that made me think, okay, well, Keynes wasn't even genuinely ethically trying to help society. Like, he knew um, that this economic decision and policy would harm society, and that was pretty crazy for me to see. And so to get off, so anyways, yeah, so gold and Bitcoin, they're similar, and for to not get too far in the weeds, but there's certain books like the Bitcoin Standard and the Bullish Case for Bitcoin that shows like 7 to 8 different objective properties of what makes money a sound form of money versus an unsound form of money. And the scarcity, durability, scalability, transferability, and all of that. And the U.S. dollar served the purpose, like banknotes serve the purpose of scalability. But its scarcity is not it's clearly not scarce because they can print as much as they want. And this is something that's been going on even before the Industrial Revolution, and there's other civilizations. And I think one of the Khan dynasties, they were doing this as well. They were clipping, or they were having all their citizens bring their gold for that they could redeem for a higher price. And so yeah, there's reasons behind gold being a monetary technology and tool because of its principles. Um, and yeah, for anybody that doesn't grasp that, Bitcoin Standard can lay out all of that. To get into uh, you know the evolution of nutrition science, could you tell me who Ansel Keys was?
Ansel Keys was a young man who grew up in the early 1900s, and he was pretty ambitious. Went on to study saltwater eels a bit, had a kind of diverse career at one point. United States military contracted him to come up with a small bundle of food that soldiers could take with them that was non-perishable. He came up with something called the K rations, which the troops absolutely hated. But in the 1950s, things transitioned with Keys when the American public's attention shifted from World War II, which had ended, to heart health. And this was inspired by largely a heart attack that the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, had. He was hospitalized for 8 days. So the country was extremely afraid of what became known as the silent killer. And the race was on to try to find out what had happened, because the heart attacks, doctors in the beginning of the 1900s, many of them had never even heard of a heart attack. They've never met a patient who had one. And suddenly, more and more people were. And it was terrifying in the same way like a school shooting or a shark attack is, because it seems like it comes out of nowhere. And so the country was very fixated on this question. And Keys, who didn't have any credentials in cardiovascular heart health studies or nutrition, he had a theory that the saturated fat found in meat raised cholesterol, which clogged the heart. And this was what he called the heart health hypothesis. And when he came up with it and he introduced it, the medical establishment kind of laughed at him. Because of the data behind it. He was using all these observational studies. And for your audience, an observational study is a study where it's basically handing out flyers. You can't control variables, because the observational study is me equivocating and saying, I polled 94% of people who've ever had cancer, and they all said that they had drinking milk at some point. So I can say a truthful study that says cancer associated with milk intake. And that's kind of how observational studies work. They can't control variables, as opposed to a randomized control study, which can control variables and therefore can establish causal relationships, where observational studies only establish association, potential association. So that was all Keyes worked in. And he came up with this theory. It wasn't taken seriously. So finally, he got fed up with everybody being like, where's your evidence? Why do you think this? People have been eating meat for thousands of years. And a lot of scientists like John Yudkin in Britain thought maybe sugar had a correlation. There was also a steep rise in smoking at the time. And the introduction of seed oils came in the early part of the century. And that was a big shift in the American diet. All these were possible culprits. Another one, potentially, people thought type A personalities. So all these factors could be it. Keyes stuck to red meat being the cause. And he finally decided to engage in a real study, a clinical double-blind research study in 1968 called the Minnesota Coronary Survey. And this would be a 4-year study in nursing homes in Minnesota with thousands of participants, where all the meals were controlled. So the variables could be controlled. And you could really probably establish a causal relationship between saturated fat and heart health. That was the goal. So 1972 rolls around, the study's over. Nobody talks about it. There's no release. Decades pass. We go through all these reforms based on the diet heart hypothesis, which becomes ingrained for various reasons, which I go over in Fiat Food, into basically conventional wisdom. In 2016, a reporter from the New York Times just becomes curious, whatever happened to that study? It was the only study we've ever had that was a controlled randomized study on this hypothesis. What happened to it? Was able to reach out to one of the investigators who worked with Keyes on the study, but who had passed, reached out to his son, and the son was able to find some boxes in the basement that were all the research, all the study was right there. And a bunch of data experts from the New York Times went through it. And to their shock, it showed the exact opposite of what Keyes had proposed. It showed that patients who had an increase in saturated fat intake had better health outcomes. And patients who had higher cholesterol had better health outcomes. Patients who had low cholesterol had significantly worse health outcomes. And Gary Taubes, who's a really great nutrition investigative reporter in this field, approached one of the investigators who was still around, who'd worked on this study, and said, "Why didn't you release this earlier?" And the investigator responded, "Well, there was nothing wrong with the study, but we were just so disappointed in the results." And if you think about what happened since 1971 in nutrition science, where we had first the 1980 dietary guidelines come out, which was the first time the government really had firm guidelines on telling us what we should eat. For thousands of years, people just knew what to eat. They didn't need books or podcasts or the government to tell them how to eat. But it said that we needed to increase our grains and decrease our red meat. This took a huge evolution by 1992 with the 1992 dietary food pyramid, which told us specific amounts for the first time. 8 to 11 fist-sized servings of grains a day, which is a recipe for metabolic destruction, to limit saturated fat to almost nothing. And people might say, well, this is just the government saying what we should eat. What's it really matter? We all ignore the government. No, you don't. Not if you are a public school student, for instance, in the 90s, because that policy became ingrained as law for public schools to adhere to. So what did the public school children of 1992 realize? They saw their tallow switch to seed oils that fried their chicken nuggets. They saw their whole milk switch to low fat milk, which nobody drank because it tasted like ass. So they began infusing it with strawberry and chocolate, which by the time that was over, it had just as much sugar as soda. And They promoted processed grains. So by the time I came out of high school in 1997, I didn't graduate, but my high school career I did. I was already metabolically compromised. And I think most kids are, but it's only gotten worse. I mean, you look in New York right now, they're eliminating meat entirely. It's meatless Mondays in their public school district. But now it's gotten worse too, because the public schools aren't only giving kids lunch, it's breakfast, it's dinner sometimes in major cities, it's snack. So kids are not getting the nutrition. And that started with Ansel Keys, but it became weaponized in the early 1970s because there was a confluence of events that happened at that period. The fiat money printer was the thing that tilted the scale, because in 1970, despite a lot of corrupt nutrition science, which was sponsored by corporate influence, the majority of Americans still ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They ate meat for all three of those meals if they could afford it. But the transition happened quickly. And the reason behind it is very simple. That, as we talked about with war, the populace will tolerate endless wars from their leaders. We just do. We also tolerate massive corruption. We keep voting these people into office. Rising food prices, something very different. In 2022, there was 12,500 food-related protests in Europe. And in Sri Lanka in 2022, we saw hundreds of thousands of people after the price of eggs and meat skyrocketed. The food supply shifted, stormed the palace, and the leaders had to leave. So my point is that governments are very sensitive to understanding the dynamic between rising food prices and political instability. So when Nixon decoupled, they understood completely that the food supply, the nutrients we needed, were going to go up in price. So he immediately began a campaign to distort the food that's been carried over successfully from administrations on both sides of the political spectrum to shift our diet from one of animal-based products to grains. Now, they didn't do this to hurt us. They were really concerned that in 1970, the crisis of that moment, if you weren't around, so you don't remember, I wasn't either, but in 1970, the crisis was overpopulation. That was the big scare. A book came out called The Population Bomb, which posited that we were all going to die because we were going to starve to death because there wasn't enough food. And that meat was very resource intensive, so that we needed to switch to grains to save the world. That shifted to don't eat meat because it serves as a thermostat for the temperature of the earth. That's where we currently are in terms of why not to eat meat. But in the 1940s, they were telling us not to eat meat to save the meat because our soldiers abroad needed to eat the meat and they needed to be strong. We needed to pursue. There's always a reason why the wealthy can eat meat, but the peasants should eat the grains. It shifts throughout time. But the reason behind this shift and why it accelerated beginning in 1971 and has continued to accelerate is to obfuscate the true consequences of monetary inflation. Because if you're only eating, Shane, like if you're only eating cereal and Doritos, you don't notice monetary inflation. I could feed myself in a day on one box of cereal and pay $4 for food. But the nutrients that humans need to thrive has become cost prohibitive. So what we see is meat, in particular red meat, is increasingly becoming a food of the upper class. And in the past, where obesity was looked at as a sign of affluence, it's now a sign of depravity, not of economics, but of nutrition, of the body. And that's where we are today. And it wasn't by accident. This was all by intention. That's what's infuriating to me. It wasn't some good people just making mistakes. It was a gaslighting campaign of epic proportions that continues and that people still believe. People are still believing that we should be eating Snackwell cookies, which is a chemical shitstorm, as opposed to meat. And then, you have the 2023 Tufts Food Compass. And I think about this more than I'd like to admit, because these are people, their whole life is built around finding out what foods are most nutritious for the human body. And what do they conclude after all their degrees would not be able to fit on our screen. They're so numerous. They've established that Lucky Charms are healthier than red meat. And chocolate flavored soy milk is healthier than whole milk. Like, this is what we're facing. And then we have the president vigorously defending this. It's insane.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just amazing to me to see how Ansel Keys wasn't even like he didn't study nutritional science. He didn't um he seems to have a similarity with Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who was the economist, where he was very good at persuasion. I remember in the chapter with John Maynard Keynes in chapter one how he was very uh, good at aggressively arguing about any
From
subject
any
with a
side.
great passion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Keyes seems to have been able to. I mean, clearly he didn't get a degree in nutritional science, or even back then, I don't even know if there was a department or a major you could have in college for that. But he was able to make his way into the American. I think it was the American Heart
With
Association.
no history of anything to do with heart health. Like, he became on the board of the American Heart Association after they had rejected his diet heart hypothesis. 2 years later, he's on the board and they embrace it. That's the kind of guy he was. But it was also to the benefit of the major power players. So I think I don't think these people were geniuses. I think it was like the British government was looking for justification to continue war. So they elevated John Maynard Keynes. And then you see all Western cultures elevate John Maynard Keynes. Have you ever taken a class in Keynesian economics, just out of curiosity?
Well, to be honest, I believe I did. So I went to UMass Amherst, and I was in the business school, and so I had to take micro and macroeconomics, and to be yeah, to be yeah. Admittedly, I don't remember too much of what I learned from those two classes, but I believe Keynesian economics was
That is
definitely
your mind's self-defense mechanism at work right there. Because what happened to you, I guarantee you, it didn't make sense.
yeah.
Because it doesn't make sense. The idea that we need to just keep printing more money to grow the economy, it's dumb. Like, that's
Mm,
childlike logic. But the only way this persists is if we defer and outsource our knowledge through shame. Oh, I'm not smart enough to quite understand this very elaborate the Keynesian multiplier effect is espoused by Nancy Pelosi, where if we tax the people $2, it actually puts $4 into our economy. Like, what?
mhm,
Fuck you. Like, you're fucking lying about everything. So this is insane, and I'm not stupid. But when you talk to most people, they'll be like, well, I don't understand economics. You do, which is why that doesn't make sense. And that was part of this whole gaslighting campaign. We're supposed to feel like intellectually inferior to these people like Keynes and these it's you find the same thing in medicine and in food. It's like, well, of course, true. I mean, all the experts say that Lucky Charms are healthier than red meat. I mean, it's science by consensus, not by repeatable results, which used to be what science was pre-COVID.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just it's wild to think Keys, instead of trying to find objective data like a true scientist. I mean, he's not even a scientist, but I mean, maybe he is if he was studying eels and he was
Yeah.
looking at marine ecology. But it just seems apparent that he was searching for data that would support his theories, not data that would be objective um, and benefit the health of humanity. And it's it's been a repercussion of his selfish focus on supporting his own theories has altered the food system. The American Heart Association supporting all these different theories. I mean, it's had repercussions for decades, and to get into the development of the American Standard Diet and showing at the bottom of the food pyramid, grain being the main food category that we should eat. I know that there's another player in the game here, and also to I don't want to get too off track, but I mean, you mentioned how, and we can get into this too, because I read I think it might have been in chapter 8 or 9, talking about how like the relationship between nutrition, climate, religion, like religion as well. There's an interconnectivity with religion and nutrition and human behavior, um, and how that was coalesced with the government. And yeah, we're seeing in modern day. Yeah, you mentioned New York City, uh, trying to end the consumption of red meat. And I recently saw the governor of Florida. He's putting by law, I think he put it into law, banning lab grown meat, supporting regenerative agriculture, which is a me personally, that I think that's a great step forward. Some people think it's an abuse of power that a government or a state government is making that decision. And I've seen people push back, people as especially even people that are having a meat based diet, they're pushing back saying that's a little aggressive. But for me, with the knowledge that I have from Fiat Food, um, it's almost a necessity through this long manipulation of our food system. And listen, I was born in '93, and I, my I remember I was a pretty healthy eater. My family always mentions how I was a pretty healthy eater. I would never finish my Halloween candy, um, whereas like all my friends would like just completely demolish their entire bag of candy from Halloween. But at breakfast sometimes I would have eggs and bacon, but other times I would have Pop Tarts and toaster strudels. And I remember there was like purple ketchup you could put on your food, and all these different things. And nowadays you can buy Lay's chips that are Pepsi Cola flavored. It's just gotten so out of hand. And um, but to get into there's chapter 3, the Seventh Day Adventist Church, and this was mind blowing to me. So Kellogg, I mean, everybody should probably know Kellogg brand, right? I mean, that's a huge cereal, grain, uh, company, corporation. But how Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg, started this food company, is pretty wild. It was, I'd like to get into this church and how Kellogg was a part of this church, his religious views, and what dictated those religious views, how it dictated um, his initiatives, uh, and forming his company. If you could get into
Sure.
that.
In the late 1800s, there was a movement called the Millerite movement, and they believed that nutrition was linked to spirituality and the end of times was coming. The leader of the movement made a mistake that smart cult leaders do not make, which you're supposed to be vague about when the apocalypse is coming. This man gave a specific date, and there is a day where thousands of people waited outside for the end of the world. They had sold their possessions, and it just never came. And Miller ended up leaving in seclusion, in shame. Fast forward a little bit, a young woman who was part of the Millerite movement, had gone to see several of Millerite sermons, is walking home from school and she gets hit in the head with a rock. She wakes up from a short coma and believes that God is speaking to her directly and telling her that the end of times is in fact coming, and that we need to purify our bodies and minds. And we do this through ending the vile, evil sexual feelings that people have. Because at the beginning of the 1900s, there was a real belief that a lot of disease, almost all disease actually, among some people believed, came from carnal desires and masturbation, that this was the source of almost every health malady. So there was a belief by this young woman named Ellen G. White, who would go on to found the Seventh Day Adventist Church, that the human diet is what caused these carnal desires, and in particular, red meat. And she was actually ahead of her time for this. There wasn't a lot of science back then to validate it, but people instinctually knew that carnal desires came from red meat because it does really contribute to sex drive, testosterone, red meat. It's a thing now. We know this. At the time, she knew this too. So she wanted to come up with a way to replace the red meat of the American populace with grains. And she tasked one of her young proteges, a guy named John Harvey Kellogg, to come up with something specifically for breakfast that would shift the American diet away from meat at breakfast to grains. And he came up with Kellogg's cornflakes as his anti-masturbatorial tool, in particular for young men. Now, John Harvey Kellogg, is hard to overstate his influence. He became a celebrity doctor of the day, went around the country giving speeches and had a lot of papers. He was also a complete sociopath. He advocated pouring carbolic acid on the clitorises of young women so that they would never feel sexual pleasure. Anesthesia or surgery on young men without anesthesia so they'd remember the pain and associate pain with sexual pleasure. Cages, tying people's hands. And when he discovered later that Ellen White was actually eating meat the whole time and not telling people, like a lot of these vegans are just complete frauds. And because she's human, she wants to eat meat. Her particular vice was fried chicken. He discovered this. He left the church but stayed in the same realm. He moved into eugenics, where he was able to convince the Michigan legislature to sterilize over 3,100 undesirable women so that they couldn't reproduce. This is the kind of man we're talking about, John Harvey Kellogg. So how does this have to do with health today? I'm getting there. John Harvey Kellogg at the church had a protege named Leanna Cooper. She started the American Dietetics Association, which over time became the de facto nutrition health organization in America. Still, with all these factors, with John Harvey Kellogg, with Leanna Cooper, Kellogg cereal, with industry-funded science through Ansel Keys, that was all propaganda. In 1970, people were still eating meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. August 15th, 1971, when Nixon decoupled, suddenly this new powerful force entered into dietary nutrition, the fiat money printer. The first thing Nixon did to this end was he appointed a man named Earl Butz to become the Secretary of Agriculture. Butz began using the fiat money printer to change the farming community, where we used to have this cornucopia of independent farmers. His slogan was, "Go big or go home." And he did this through direct subsidizations that small farmers couldn't compete with. Billions of dollars to corn, soy, and sugar, which sugar doesn't even need incentive because it's an addictive drug once it became refined. It's a different topic. But pre-1971, subsidies existed, but they were small. And the reason was because, like war, if you were going to print $6 billion of promissory notes that were backed by gold to give to the corn lobby, you need the consent of the public or sell maybe corn bonds. Post 1971, you didn't need that. You could take the people's wealth just by printing the money and diluting everybody else's currency. So you see this begin to happen, and then you see funding begin flowing from the fiat money printer to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which formed a university called Loma Linda University in California, whose main job is to churn out nutrition studies. And the government gave hundreds of millions of fiat dollars to this church post 1971. And this church, it's not science, they're observational studies, as we discussed, but they're all observational studies that validate a religious conviction. So I guarantee you that 99% of the studies that you and your audience have come across in the form of news articles that say red meat causes cancer, red meat causes baldness, red meat causes acne, all comes from this one university run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church to validate a religious conviction through observational studies. And I spoke to a lot of nutrition scientists who explained to me that this isn't real science. And the other scientists understand this. It's not meant to be, it's meant to generate headlines. It's not for other scientists to look at. It's to generate headlines that people won't really read the studies. They'll just see the headlines. And you see this increase at that point as to why the church, even today, is remarkably powerful in terms of nutrition of the public. Unlike industry, who just makes more money off of selling Doritos, is a higher price point than selling meat. And unlike the government, who is interested in transitioning our food supply to grains because it gives the appearance that we live in an abundance of food, when in reality, the nutrition we need to thrive as a people has been degraded. The church is actually just honest believers. Like, they just believe that for the salvation of mankind, we need to transition from meat to grains. But you see this confluence of events. And I want to stress that there is no smoky room. I don't even know these people, they never got together and planned this. What happened was, with fiat, it just all became in their best interest. So you see all these chips fall. So you see a lot, like you mentioned some of the books that you read on this subject. And my only, I think all their arguments are pretty good. Like, you hear Cali Means talk about the corporate influence a lot, and I think he makes some really good points. But I think what is missed is that these corporations are only following the incentives set up by the government. That's it. Like, they're just acting
Yeah.
in their best interest. Their best interest didn't always used to be so perverted, but fiat perverted it when they began pushing for the changes in our food supply. So why, when you go to Mexico and you drink Coke, are you drinking cane sugar, which is horrible for you? But why here are we drinking corn? That's gross. What the fuck is that? Why are we drinking corn in our Coke? That's weird, right? It's also far worse for you than sugar. It's the next step. So, like, sugar in the 1700s, people had about 4 pounds a year on average, but it wasn't refined. So it was diluted with fiber and other shit. The refinement process worked in the same way that you make cocaine, where you boil down the exact essence of the plant. So it's hyper powerful and addictive. And that's the next step from that, is this high fructose corn syrup, which takes it another step further in the way our body interacts with it. I know that was a rant, but
Yeah. No, no, no.
it's
That's
just a
fine.
complicated topic. And I try to, like, there's a lot of
Yeah.
moving
Yeah. Yeah.
parts.
Yeah. I mean, and you outline it in a very um, chronological way through the book. And so to summarize, Kellogg was, yeah, a protege of this church, and the church believed there was a second coming of Christ by a certain date, and they had this very uh, somewhat extreme and conservative ideology when it came to sex. And just from my experience, like, you can't eradicate the sexual desire. Like, you just can't do that. I mean, that's a natural that's a natural part of being a human being. Our hormonal system is built into us to reproduce, to procreate, and to think that you're going to suppress your sexual desires by changing your diet. um, I mean, I don't even, I mean, yes, you're going to have maybe a very low testosterone level, but you're still probably going to, want to procreate and want to reproduce. And yeah, they may have had, it seems like they may have had, they try to have um, moral intentions with creating this religious community to not succumb to over sexualization. It's still, I mean, it's pretty extreme to have these like chemical castrations or caging. Yeah, I mean, you talked about putting chemicals on women and caging men, and um, yeah, you just can't suppress that. I mean, our hormonal system. I'm also pretty interested in a holistic health approach. There's someone that I admire. His name's Paul Chek. He created the Chek Institute, and he looks at the body as a system of systems. And so when you look at the traditional medical system, what they're doing is they're looking at it from a reductionist scientific perspective, and they treat certain things. And when you treat a certain system, you're affecting all of the other systems. So when when you're trying to suppress your hormonal levels, you're affecting so many other aspects of your body, and so you're just making humans unhealthy by you know illustrating this diet that doesn't raise testosterone levels. And I don't even I think you're defeating your purpose. You're defeating your aim by doing that. Like if your aim and your purpose is to reduce sexual desires and do that through manipulating or changing your nutrition, you're making other aspects of the body unhealthy. And then like human beings are not, their way of living is probably their way of operating and their emotional levels and all of that stuff. Like it's just unhealthy. And so I don't, me personally, like, you know, when my nutrition and my diet was pretty unhealthy, I was not in a good place. I was not, my highest self, if you will. Like I just, it's pretty radical the way that that viewpoint.
Shane, though, I would argue
Was
that they've been remarkably successful. You have a bunch of fat kids eating cornflakes and frosted flakes and cinnamon
Oh
toast
yeah,
crunch all day with skim milk, right? And what happens? Look at our fertility rates right now. We're
oh yeah,
where Paul Ehrlich predicted in the population bomb in 1970 that we would be by 1986 all starving and overpopulated. We have countries that are begging for families now and incentivizing them financially because they're dying. The cultures are dying.
yeah.
We're not as fertile as we used to be. And I think diet isn't the only reason. I think there's a whole host of potential reasons, but I think diet is a primary. I think diet's the head of the class, eating all these grains. You go historically and look at wars that were delayed in the 1400s and in the Dark Ages because their troops didn't have enough meat. They needed to get the meat first, and then
Mm,
they go to war and they fight. Today, and then they procreate. Today, we're not procreating like we used to.
hmm.
Something's really wrong. And I think there's a lot of
Yeah,
factors. I'm not saying it's as simplistic as grains, but you eat a bunch of grains. I don't know about you. When I eat a bunch of grains, I need to rest for an hour and a half and just like
yeah,
process.
yeah, yeah. So Kellogg, you know, he he created the Kellogg company, what people know as like Frosted Flakes and all these different cereals. It's a massive company. And I know he didn't want to. You touched on a lot of things when I asked about describing who Kellogg was. Um, to summarize, he created this company with his, I think, his brother.
Yeah.
And this, there's a point where his brother introduces tons of sugar into the cereal versus, you know, um, the initial purpose was to just bring grain and not incorporate sugar because they also thought sugar was. I think John Harvey Kellogg did not want to do that, but his brother did because it incentivized. Well, one, like the sugar that was put into the cereal was addictive and it brought more profits and um, yeah, I mean,
Did you see recently the CEO of Kellogg's just a few weeks ago came out and he was on CNBC and he were talking about inflation. And he was like, the best way to deal with inflation is we're now marketing cereal for dinner, not just breakfast, for
yeah,
dinner too. Well, yeah, because you won't notice the rise in price of food if you're eating cereal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The
yeah.
food supply seems relatively cheap, but at the far end of that, the medical industry is going to be cleaning up at a much earlier and at a much costlier and a much more profit centric pace if we can start getting people to eat cereal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah, so the climbing power between Kellogg's company and the cereal grain based company as a source of nutrition that rose to power, and there's a connection to the government and subsidizing corn and grain and sugar. Um, I'd like to. There's a section of a certain chapter where you talk about CPI. That's a pretty well known um, concept within economics, modern economics, which is it stands for the Consumer Price Index. Um, you talk about how, I would love for you to talk about how that has initially been a measurement for the public with from an economic perspective and how that was manipulated. And so because you know, there's corporate interests that are now infiltrated within nutrition. The government's interested in subsidizing corn and all this stuff and making sure that food prices don't get too high. There seems to be, a manipulation of what basket of goods that are included in the consumer price index. There's a manipulation of that basket of goods, and they did that. It seems to not raise fear within the public because when you initially the consumer price index incorporated steak and eggs and milk and all these healthy natural foods, but then when through the continuous manipulation of credit creation and inflation, those prices rose, which would then put fear into Americans. And so they took out those basket of goods, the meat, milk, and dairy, and all that stuff, and they just swapped it, I believe, for these cereals and these grains, and because they have the ability to create, or they have all um, these large farmers that are pushing out the local small farmers. um, they're just producing tons of corn, and I feel like I'm kind of going all over the place here, but there seems to be an interconnectivity between this evolution of corporate interest and government and this church, putting their ideology to the public, and then they manipulated the CPI.
Of course, and you're right on. Like what you're saying is totally spot on. It's a statistical tautology, meaning the CPI tracks consumer spending based on purchases with the dollar. But the problem is that people make purchases based on that same dollar. So when prices in dollars change on a certain good, for instance, steak, and you switch to soy burgers, which are far cheaper because the price using those dollars has gone up, the CPI literally just replaces one for the other. And where in the beginning, the CPI came out in World War One. During that time, there was like fixed objects, and you could actually use it to track kind of reliably the rising price of goods. But what happened under Arthur Burns, who was the Treasury Secretary under Richard Nixon, he began taking, what did he call them? Like more dynamic goods out of the CPI that rose in price too much. So it keeps getting just messed with. It should be looked at as like a PR campaign. The CPI is not math; it's a PR campaign. Recently, a few weeks ago, they took out coffee went up 36%. So guess what? They took it out of the CPI. It's no longer in the basket of goods. There's no reason behind why. It's because it just went up too much. So, like, understand that it's masturbation for economists looking to rationalize future money printing. That's what the CPI is. It's not a reliable gauge because there's no fixed number that you like. That's not math. When there's nothing fixed, there's no fixed thing that you could pin it to. I'll tell you what is a better measure of CPI. Look at McDonald's prices from 1990. Look at it today. Not perfect because a lot of subsidies went into a lot of those products. But like behind you, you can't see. I collect old newspapers and I find it fascinating to look at the ads and just what meat used to cost.
Mm,
And in
yeah.
the middle class and the lower classes could buy meat pre 1970. Today, you would think that the quality and the standard of life has gone up because there's more dollars and people have more. When I was a kid, there was a game called Life, a board game, where I think the highest profession you could be was a lawyer and you got paid 50 grand a year. If I got paid 50 grand a year, I wouldn't be able to feed my family. I have 4 kids and a wife. I can't. Like that's not upper class anymore. But while we have more dollars and we have more food, the nutrients we need have become so degraded that our bodies are manifesting this poverty. And you could just go into any Walmart in America and look in line and you'll see the true CPI in the shape of their physical health. And it's not something I'm poking fun of. I'm not. I was a fat kid. It sucks. And a lot of these people are trying to do right. I had a guest at my house the other day. They literally told me they don't eat meat because they're trying to lose weight. And one thing I've learned is to not talk about my work during people's dinner. But I just my wife looked at me like we were waiting for like the punchline. Nothing came. It's like people still believe this. People still
Yeah.
believe like this propaganda that's put out by these credentialed experts. And one of the benefits I think of COVID, to kind of come back to that, is that there is a break in the trust of these credentialed experts among the public, amongst people like you and people like me, where we used to just sort of assume they were telling the truth, but it's all being exposed right now. And there's a bit of a movement towards self autonomy where we don't need these people to tell us what pharmaceutical products we have to shoot into our arm every other month, or how to cover our face when we're in public, or that we need to increase the Fruit Loops and decrease the meat. We're starting to be like, actually, what did my great great grandmother do? Like, she seemed to kind of have it going on. She seemed all right. She lived to be 96 years old. She wasn't fat. She didn't have any of these metabolic problems that we had. Or what are the Maasai doing in Africa? Boy, they haven't had any carbs almost ever. They might eat honey once in a while. They don't have any cancer or heart disease. How do they live off of the diet of only red meat and milk? Maybe a little honey here and there, and they don't have heart attacks or cancers. What has happened? Same with the Inuit in Alaska. Inuit. No plants grow, yet they're among the healthiest people on earth. What? Yet we have all this advancement. We're so advanced. We're so advanced, yet we're all fat and sick and dying. Sorry, that got
Yeah.
dark. That got dark at the end.
No, 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 no. I mean, it's not really dark. It's just it's reality, and um, people could read the book and say, "Oh, it's you source the book incredibly too." I mean, there's tons of resources there for people to also double check and
Fact check me. Yeah, 212 citations. I'm pretty thorough with this because I know how it sounds. And I'm writing this assuming that people are going to have my reaction when they first heard this theory. And they're going to want to fact
yeah,
check it. I just wanted to make it easy for them.
yeah, yeah. And you were saying how when you're at a dinner table, you try not to discuss this book, and there's times where I send things to my parents or family or friends. I'll show them, you know, I'll show them certain statistics or information about this kind of stuff because I've discussed like I'm pretty passionate about this, and through observation and experience, I just see the health of society. Like you said, going into a Walmart, you can just see. I don't like shopping at Walmart because the products there are pretty low quality, and you see people and they're just the chronic diseases around the country: obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, health. It's we've never had this, and or we've never seen the rate of these chronic diseases as high as they are now. We've never seen this before, and some of us are just born into this, so we don't know how it used to be. But like I remember my great grandmother, she would be very simple, just whole foods, butter, milk, meat, vegetables. She had her own garden, and I'm grateful to have spent time with her when I was a small child, um, and then versus having Pop Tarts and all these different things, you can just feel the difference. And some people, unfortunately, they don't. These kids are just born into eating Cheetos and Doritos, and they don't know how it feels to then substitute actual natural foods. And um, yeah, there's a part just to kind of conclude on the CPI section. There's a part that you sourced from the Fiat Standard by Safedine, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read off a section of
Oh man,
that.
Safe's the OG. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, he is. So this is about CPI. So as prices of highly nutritious foods rise, people are inevitably forced to replace them with cheaper alternatives. As the cheaper foods become a more prevalent part of the basket of goods, the effect of inflation is understated. To illustrate the point, imagine you earn $10 a day and spend them all on eating a delicious ribeye steak that gives you all the nutrients you need for the day. In this simple, and many would argue optimal consumer basket of goods, the CPI is $10. Now imagine one day hyperinflation strikes the economy and the price of your ribeye increases to $100 while your daily wage remains $10. What happens to the price of your basket of goods? It cannot rise tenfold because you cannot afford the $100 ribeye. Instead, you make do with the chemical shitstorm that is the soy burger for $10. The CPI magically shows zero inflation. No matter what happens with monetary inflation, the CPI is destined to lag behind as a measure because it is based on consumer spending, which itself is determined by prices. Price rises do not elicit equivalent increase in consumer spending. They bring about reductions in quality of consumed goods. The change in the cost of living cannot be reflected in the price of the average basket of goods because the goods comprising that basket are in turn determined by the change in the price. This is how we can understand the prices continue to rise while the CPI registers at the politically optimal 2 to 3% per year level. If you are happy to substitute industrial waste sludge for ribeyes, you will not experience much inflation. And you then, this is your writing. It is through the flexibility in the basket of goods that government authorities have been empowered to change the CPI from a tool originally intended to measure a rise in the prices of goods over a specific period of time to its current iteration that serves to obfuscate the theft of American wealth committed through the devaluation mechanism of its fiat printing press. I highlighted that section because I thought it was really well, that part from Safedine was well worded and it gives you a simple numbers and a simple example of a ribeye and just switching the products to really obfuscate and deter the public's view of what's actually going on with the economy is, I mean, it's extreme and it's unethical and people are just being manipulated with that. And so a way to conclude, if you could just summarize, because I haven't gotten fully into the two chapters, but what the agro educational complex and the medical industrial complex is, and then maybe to conclude, you've got some chapters towards the end of the book. Maybe just to conclude on a good note, how Bitcoin helps fix the economy and the American diet.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. When I talk about the agro-industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industrial complex and how they're all intertwined, and it's like leaves, vines wrapping on a pole, I bring out an example of what happened in January of 2023. Now, we talked about the Tufts Food Compass. That came out early 2023, January 1st. And it posited that the meat and the food that our ancestors ate for generations was not something to be consumed. But like Lucky Charms, almond soy milk, Honey Nut Cheerios with apple flavoring, these were the ideal foods for humanity. That same month, on January 5th, I believe, 60 Minutes aired an episode hosted by journalist Leslie Stahl, where she was talking about a new breakthrough in health. And it was this idea that obesity, which for so long was considered a result of lifestyle choice, was actually a genetic brain disease. And this really struck me because I find this woman, this expert who posited this, her name is Dr. Fatima Stanford, just a vile piece of humanity. Because I can't think of anything more wicked in a sense than telling people that this fundamental aspect of what it's like to be a human, the ability to take care of our own health, what she's doing is undermining that by saying, no, it's not your fault. You're unhealthy because of a genetic brain disease. She is a paid consultant for Ozempic. And on this show, the only other expert was also a paid consultant for Ozempic. The show was sponsored by Novo Nordisk, who is the parent company of these weight loss drugs. And at no point were alternative, like lifestyle changes even posited. It was just this advertisement for this weight loss drug. So you start with the Tufts food pyramid coming out saying that not to eat meat, to eat food that makes you fat and sick. That was government sponsored. So Tufts is a private university, but the funding was through government and corporate funding towards that study. Tens of millions of dollars. I forget the exact figure off the top of my head, but that's not a conspiracy. You just go on their website. They have their corporate partnerships. That same month, you had this show air on 60 Minutes positing the science that obesity was not a result of lifestyle, but a genetic brain disease. So that takes it out of the control of the individual, puts it in the control of the lab coat. Just 2 weeks later, same year, 2 weeks later, the American Pediatric Association, for the first time in 12 years, updates their guidance on how to treat childhood obesity. Now, pediatricians are supposed to recommend these same weight loss drugs for kids as young as 11. And you dig in a little further, you find out that, of course, the American Pediatric Association is in partnership with PepsiCo, Dannon. So what you find is this confluence of events all happening at the same time, which is telling people to eat the foods that make them sick, telling them that they have it doesn't matter what they eat, actually. They have no control over their own obesity. It's a genetic brain disease. But here on the other side, the pharmaceutical companies are coming to clean up. And I found no evidence that they colluded. I found no evidence that they got together. I found that, again, it was all just in their best interests. So they all profit the most if we're sick and dying, essentially. I mean, it seems like they view people more as, not that they're trying to intentionally hurt us, but they view us as a means to an end. And that end is our profit, their profit. How do we fix this? I argue Bitcoin. And Bitcoin isn't in and of itself a solution to actually anything. But what it does do, this is my opinion, Saifedean and many others know far more about cryptocurrency than I do. But one thing I do understand is that the Federal Reserve is the mechanism behind the distortions. And if you end the incentive to distort the price and consequences of monetary inflation, then you return things back to nature, to a sense of normalcy, where people can decide and make their own decisions, not based on what the government propaganda or subsidies or all these different mechanisms that have gone on to distort our food supply. Those are removed, because if there isn't inflation, then there's no reason to distort inflation. And every time you buy Bitcoin and you transfer your fiat to Bitcoin, what you're doing is you're taking a stab and a jab at the fiat money printer and all these distortions. And it's not just in food. It's perverted nearly everything in life. You can make the case, and Saifedean does very effectively. So I say, eat meat, don't listen to the nutrition scientists, ignore them, and buy Bitcoin. And we're gonna get to a better place if we can get enough people just doing those three things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for summarizing that. Yeah, I've had people when I've been in the sauna. I've had people. I was serious when I was conversing with these people. I had just met them, and I was just talking about how I'm going to a conference or this event it's incentivizing Bitcoin and beef and buying beef with Bitcoin, and they all laughed. They all were like, they thought I was just being a weirdo, and it was just interesting to see that reaction from them, because they were like, "Oh, that sounds crazy." Cryptocurrency, to using cryptocurrency as the main form of exchange, buying it from using it to buy beef from your rancher. Yeah, the public sentiment is just they think it's kind of wacky. They don't see the connections, but you have to kind of dive deep to understand the interconnectivity between money as it's a technology for a peaceful interaction, are a measurement of intersubjective value. And so then by these price signals being manipulated, it kind of changes people's values in a way that may not be natural to them. So super important. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for your time. I'll let you go.
Thanks for having me, Shane. I really appreciate it, man. It was great seeing you again too. I saw you in Austin, and it's just you're doing great work. Yeah, keep buying your beef with Bitcoin because you're going to help those people in the sun, and they don't even know it. That's okay.